And I understand you have some involvement with this, so I was wondering if you just sort of describe some of the activities which you and your sort of organisations that you work with get up to try to improve resilience on an international basis.
Sure. Well, perhaps the first point by way of context, Henry, is to say that we run a WHO collaborating centre here at Cardiff Metropolitan University, which has run for the last 20 years or so. And the work we're involved with is largely around major chemical incidents, so explosions, fires, anything that could have an impact on public health. But that said, the principles around chemical incident management are directly transferable to any major disaster. The same principles apply. And you mentioned the word resilience, which I think is an absolutely key phrase. You've got to have capacity, skills capacity, public health capacity in order to have that resilience. So there's an old maxim that if you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail. So when you have a major incident, it's not just a question of pulling all the stops out. If you haven't undertaken pre-planning, pre-preparedness, then you are in effect doomed to fail. So I think really the starting point in responding to such incidents, ensuring that you have this resilience, is to look at the picture in the cold light of day before something has happened. What are the likely scenarios that we might see? In the case of chemicals, for example, what chemicals do we use on a daily basis? Which are the most toxic ones? If we're looking at natural disasters, are we in a flood zone? Are we potentially going to be exposed to volcanic ash? Is there the potential of an earthquake, a tsunami? So all these things are predictable in many ways. So clearly there's not much point preparing for snow if you live in a tropical climate, just to labour the point. So you want to be looking at the hazards in a tailored, prioritised way. What are the hazards that people are likely to be exposed to? Excuse me. And what are the risks to the community from those hazards? So you can do a rough and ready risk prioritisation based on the hazard and its likely consequences. So that should really be the starting point, I think, for developing resilience. And once you've done that, you can start thinking about, well, how do I reduce or mitigate the risks to the public from those hazards? For example, if you live in a Pacific country, for the sake of argument, and there's a risk of a tsunami, then perhaps you should have buoys in the ocean that can detect reduction in pressures. Perhaps you should have escape routes in place so people can go to the hills. Likewise, if you're in danger of flooding, perhaps you shouldn't be building on floodplains. So you can't categorically prevent disasters, but by sensible pre-planning and preparedness, you can at least reduce the impact. So I think these are all common sense measures that emergency planners, public health professionals, environmental health officers, doctors, emergency responders, etc., working as part of a multidisciplinary team can think about well in advance and put some of these measures in place. So having done this little grid, if you like, of what are the hazards, what are the risks, what can we do to reduce the risk, you'll inevitably come to the conclusion that there's going to be some risk left over, what technically is referred to as residual risk. So residual risk is very much the point then for emergency planning and preparedness, which again needs to be undertaken before an incident actually occurs. So planning, as the name suggests, is about writing a plan. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? Who's going to do it? And in what time frame? That's all an emergency plan is. But clearly, if that plan is going to be effective, all the major players need to buy in, whether it's one of the international charities such as the International Red Cross or International Red Crescent, whether it's local responders, whether it's government agencies. Everybody has to buy in to the emergency plan and contribute to it. People sometimes use the phrases planning and preparedness interchangeably, but actually they're quite separate. They're interrelated, but separate. Planning, as we were saying, is very much about writing a plan.
Yeah.
But if you just write a plan, that doesn't mean you're prepared for an emergency. Preparedness, by definition, is about a state of readiness.
Okay.
So although a plan contributes to preparedness, there are many other aspects to preparedness. So for example, if you're going to be prepared for dealing with a major incident, again, whether it's a tsunami, a volcano, flooding, chemical incident, terrorism, whatever it may be, you have to have a number of components in place. You mentioned again resilience. You've got to have suitably trained staff who are familiar with operating under such circumstances. And one way of doing this, of course, is to run regular exercises and scenarios to get staff to interact. I think you can only learn about these incidents either through exposure to them or participating in exercises. Yeah. Otherwise, when something happens, you're not going to know what to do.
You're learning for the first time.
You're learning first, which is not the time to be doing it, of course. And exercises can take the form of very many different types. You could have a desktop exercise where you sit in front of a computer and somebody asks you questions. It certainly has value, but it's somewhat limited.
Yeah.
On the other hand, perhaps you could have a more complicated scenario. You could have players from all the major agencies around the room. You talk and you interact and you're expected to make decisions. That has the benefit, I think, Henry, of allowing you to understand the respective roles and responsibilities of different agencies. You get to know the principal players. So when the incident happens, you're dealing with familiar human beings, which reduces the stress, optimises performance, I think. Perhaps the best kind of exercise is one, however, where you're out in the field, where you have a simulation of an event. So, for example, you could simulate maybe a building collapsing, and certainly in some countries there are facilities available for doing search and rescue under such circumstances. That is a very good way of imposing realism on an exercise, but clearly takes a lot of organisation, a lot of time, a lot of resource, costs a lot of money. But I think it's key to say that you've got to have that experience if you're going to be dealing efficiently with an incident, and you have to have suitably qualified and experienced staff. So I think one of the key points of this is that if you are going to develop resilience for major incidents, you've got to have not only the right numbers of staff, but suitably qualified staff. And that is by far and away the most important component of preparedness.
Do you have any difficulties with trying to attract funding to this area if people don't perceive it as being a priority?
I think there are always going to be competing priorities. I think in the great majority of countries, health budgets are always under pressure. There can be things that happen commonly, such as heart attacks, people breaking legs, trauma, etc., which happen on a daily basis. So therefore, they're always going to take a large proportion of the budget. And major incidents, by definition, don't happen terribly often, and therefore maybe get pushed to one side until they happen, and then resources are then found. So I think, yes, it can be difficult to find resourcing for this particular area because of competing demands. But then again, I think the writing's on the wall, because if we look at climate change, we are seeing more incidents that previously were described as maybe once in 100 years, flooding in many parts of the world, severe drought, tsunamis, etc., all of which appear to be occurring with increasing frequency and regularity. So I think really more funding will be required, and I think more countries are perhaps now aware of the impact not only on the environment, the economy, but human health as well, which means that this is becoming disproportionately important.
So one final question is, do you think, looking at the international collaboration side of things, do you think that has become, emergency preparedness has become more recognised as an international issue and gained more commitment from governments?
Absolutely, and I think the predominant reason for that is what is called the International Health Regulations, which were introduced by WHO 80-90 years ago to look predominantly at infectious disease. But in 2005 they were modified to look at all hazards, whether they were infectious or environmental. And most countries in the world now, bar one or two, have signed up to the International Health Regulations, which are a legally binding obligation. So therefore, if you have an incident in one country which may have an impact upon trade, it may have impact on other countries by transboundary migration of pollutants or by the migration of people, you are duty bound to refer this to WHO, who in turn may declare it as a public health incident of international concern. So therefore the framework is in place for reporting such incidents, and what goes hand in glove with the requirements of the IHR are the need for countries to develop public health capacity and resilience. So this brings us around full circle to the question you first asked, namely resilience. So the international framework is in place, definitely.
Thank you very much, Professor Russell.
My pleasure.